earlier in the war. Does there come a point when they can do so much damage along the Iranian side of the strait that handicaps Iran's ability to mount these strikes? I think there's a lot of doubt about that in the US and especially in Congress right now, at a time when the administration is going to Congress to try and get more money for the war, because as we know, all it takes is a few missiles or a few drones to shut down the strait again entirely. So how we get from this point to a point where diplomacy might be a possibility without Trump stepping back, as he did in the past, and as Iran may be assuming he will do in the future, is a real question. And until then, I think the diplomatic and the economic costs will continue to pile up.
Yeah, they absolutely are. Nick, we saw strikes on Kuwait, desalination as well as the power plants, Bahrain, Jordan, first time in Syria, strikes there, as well as Iraq. Regional countries here targeted in the latest round of Iranian retaliation. Just explain to us why these countries in specific.
Kuwait, because it's close. Bahrain, because it's close. Both have strong ties. Bahrain has the naval base for the U.S. Fifth Fleet. Kuwait has multiple air bases that the United States has been using to help prosecute the war against Iran. So Iran has a lot of short-range ballistic missiles. Because Bahrain and Kuwait are close to Iran, the missiles can get there quickly. They're harder to stop. Iran can afford to send a lot of these missiles. If it's looking at a long-range war that could last, outwards of a month or more here, they do need to think about what weapon systems they're using. These are also seen as sort of the weaker of the Gulf states, if you will. We're aware that over the recent months, countries like Qatar, the UAE, Saudi have all had bilateral conversations with the Iranians. We don't know what has been worked out behind the scenes there. We know that they've been attacked, but less so than Bahrain and Kuwait. So Iran's able to inflict damage there, particularly as you mentioned, Kuwait hitting the desalination plant. The Minister for Electricity and Water went out to that plant over the weekend. Also the hitting of that oil, the oil facility there in Kuwait, a strategic hit for Iran, if you will. It was significant damage to vital equipment. That's what the Kuwaitis said. But look, Jordan, that has really come front and center for Iran. And we don't know the disposition of U.S. military hardware in the region, but Iran says, over the last week or so, they've had multiple strikes at different U.S. aircraft, whether it's helicopters, whether it's location storing other aircraft. We know that there have been the refuel tankers based there in the past. They said over the weekend that they hit a C-17 and an Orion P-8 surveillance aircraft. It's not clear that that is true or just a claim. But it does seem that Jordan is coming in the crossfire here more, or the crosshairs more, because they have a lot of U.S. military assets there that are being used in the war, and Iran has figured out either a better system of targeting them, or perhaps the defenses in Jordan are just not able to withstand the amount of firepower that's coming from Iran at the moment. So that's really put a lot of focus there, and Iran would like nothing better. Its stated aim: chase the United States from the region. You saw them attacking Aqaba airport over the weekend. There were security alerts about that over the weekend. This is a place which is bustling with tourists at this time of year. It undermines the local economy. It puts pressure on the Jordanian government, and it makes people there worried about what's next for them. And Iran knows that, and it calculates that.
Yeah, Stephen, and Nick makes a really good point. Initially, this war is going to last 4 to 6 weeks. And I think every expert I spoke to said, and I'm sure you've had sort of the same feedback, it's that this has got to end before the midterm elections. Can it? Will it? Is that sort of a big priority for President Trump?
I think that Trump would clearly like to end it before the midterm elections in November. The assumption is in Washington that he really wants to get out of this war still. But at the same time, if he walks away and Iran is still controlling the Strait of Hormuz, that is a massive strategic defeat for the United States. And for Trump personally, it will be a presidency again foundering in the waters of the Persian Gulf, if you like, that we've seen previously in the United States. And that could make things very difficult for him going forward in terms of his prestige personally and American power. So this is sharpening into a massive dilemma for Trump. And it's not just November, I think we should talk about. Advance voting in US elections in some states gets going as early as late September through October. Generally, the opinions ahead of US elections crystallize in the late summer period. If we're going to another month of $4 gasoline in the United States, which doesn't sound an awful lot elsewhere in the world, but is punitive for American drivers, especially considering a lot of the distances people have to commute to work, etc., that could be a real political point. And I think it's clear that Iran is just as aware of the political pressures on Trump as everyone in Washington is. But again, it comes back to that fundamental question: how does he get out of this? How does he get to an end game? How do they get to a point that Nick was saying where the diplomatic off-ramp is even coming into view? That is the stalemate we're in. And as much as President Trump might like a lot of things to happen, and a lot of his messaging almost seems to be wish casting throughout this war, the facts on the ground are those that unusually he can't reinvent and create a narrative to support his position.
Including the latest from the Middle East. Just in the last hour, the United States military says it launched a wave of new strikes against Iran. It marks 9 straight nights of strikes and comes after 3 U.S. service members were killed in action this weekend. CNN's Julia Benbrook joins us now with the latest from the administration. And Julia, what are you hearing about where things stand tonight?
Well, the latest is that the United States is carrying out another round of strikes against Iran. U.S. Central Command recently in a statement said this, that CENTCOM began conducting a new wave of strikes against Iran at 7 p.m. Eastern today. This is the 9th consecutive night. The strikes will continue degrading Iranian military capabilities used to attack commercial vessels and civilian mariners transiting the Strait of Hormuz. This continues days of escalation in the region. Again, this is the 9th consecutive night of U.S. strikes, and there have been waves of Iranian drones and missiles fired at a widening number of targets at countries with U.S. bases. This also comes after, on Friday, 2 U.S. service members were killed during an attack in Jordan, and 1 service member was categorized as missing in action. They're providing a bit more information there as well, saying that remains were found in that area. They are waiting to verify some of that information, though. And then on Saturday, there was a U.S. service member killed, this time in northern Iraq. And they said that that happened during a controlled detonation of unexploded ordnance from a downed Iranian one-way attack drone. This brings the total number of U.S. service members killed during this now nearly 5-month-long conflict to 17. So there are concerns that this could grow into an even wider conflict. We have not heard President Donald Trump comment directly on these most recent developments after the 2 service members were killed in Jordan. He did give a few brief phone interviews. He told the New York Post that he would speak with their families at some point. And he told News Nation that it is a very sad thing. It is in service to our country. And then he reiterated a point that he has made throughout this conflict. He said that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. So there are a lot of questions here about his strategy going forward. He is now traveling back to Washington, D.C. He spent his weekend here in New Jersey, of course, played a role there in that World Cup game at MetLife Stadium. And that's really a time when a lot of eyes are on not only him, but the United States as a whole. So waiting on a comment from him here.
And President Trump is speaking right now on his way back to Washington. Let's take a quick listen.
4 or 5 weeks. Well, you keep hitting me. This is a far bigger job that we're doing. We were doing a little job of stopping them from having a certain capability. Now we're just ending it. So it's really not the same thing. What we're doing now is we're ending any chance where they could have a nuclear missile. If you look at it, after a week and a half, not 4 weeks, a week and a half, 2 weeks, we stopped them from probably, but I don't want to have the word probably. Thank you very much, Eddie.
Thank you, sir.
All right, that was President Trump speaking at Joint Base Andrews on his way back to Washington, D.C. after attending the World Cup final. We've got our team standing by, Julia Benbrook for us, a White House correspondent, and retired Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton as well. And Julia, I just want to start with you because we had heard from Central Command leading into the president's comments today that the United States was launching new strikes, that this was the 9th consecutive night of strikes, and the president claiming Iran has been very badly damaged. Did anything else stick out to you from what the president said there?
Well, you hear him there just at the end saying they cannot have a nuclear weapon. Again, we've heard him repeat that over and over again throughout this nearly 5-month-long conflict now. And we heard Energy Secretary Chris Wright speaking earlier today about the conflict as a whole, as well as the Strait of Hormuz and how it's impacting shipping. And he was adamant that Trump wants to find a diplomatic off-ramp, a diplomatic solution here. But what has been clear so far is that that has not been successful. We have seen this just really ramp up in recent days. As you pointed out, it's the 9th consecutive night now of U.S. strikes. We've also seen waves of Iranian drones and missiles fired at a widening number of targets in countries with U.S. bases. And there are fears that this could turn into a much wider conflict. It's been just over a month since there was this hope for a diplomatic breakthrough. The Memorandum of Understanding was signed by both the United States and Iran. But in recent days, Trump has said that in his opinion, that Memorandum of Understanding is, quote, over. And then, of course, these deaths of the U.S. service members on Friday. 2 U.S. service members were killed in an attack in Jordan, and another was categorized as missing in action. They did say today that they have found remains in that area, but they are working on the verification process there. And then another U.S. service member was killed in action on Saturday, that time in northern Iraq. But of course, bringing this a lot closer to home, that brings the number of U.S. service members who have been killed in this months-long conflict to 17. And those are some of the first remarks that we're seeing on camera from Trump himself about what's taken place over the weekend in this recent escalation.
And Colonel Leighton, you know, we heard the president there saying that, confirming, of course, what we heard from Central Command in the strikes tonight, saying we hit them very hard again tonight in honor of those killed, of the service members killed. There were questions, obviously, of how the United States was going to respond as we got the news of the service members killed. But how does that sort of change the calculation ahead for the U.S. in terms of not just strikes, but strategy overall?
Yeah, Omar, it's a question that's actually a really pertinent one here, because what you're looking at is if there is an escalation of this type, every time that a U.S. service member is killed or injured, that there's another strike in Iran, and then Iranians are killed as a result of that. That is really that escalation ladder that we talk about every now and then. And it really becomes almost not only a self-fulfilling prophecy, but almost a never-ending cycle.
Including the United States military saying another U.S. service member was killed this weekend in northern Iraq. And this comes as the United States and Iran keep up fresh strikes against each other amid fears of a wider war rising in the region. The United States launching a new wave of attacks on Iran after 2 U.S. service members were killed by an Iranian strike in Jordan on Friday. And Iran is intensifying its attacks on U.S. allies in the Gulf region. Kuwait, for example, says Iran hit one of its power and water plants for the second time in 2 days. These are the kind of plants that are critical for providing fresh water to parts of the region. And defenses also intercepted strikes in Jordan and Bahrain. So joining me now is CNN international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson in Jerusalem, and CNN's Julia Benbrook is traveling with the president.
Well, just a day after U.S. Central Command announced that 2 American service members had been killed during an attack in Jordan, CENTCOM now says that another American service member has been killed in action, this time in northern Iraq. I want to pull up this statement for you now. They did provide a few more details, saying a U.S. service member in northern Iraq was killed in action July 18th during a controlled detonation of unexploded ordnance from a downed Iranian one-way attack drone. A second service member was wounded and continues to receive medical treatment for a minor injury. This brings the total of deaths of U.S. service members during this now nearly 5-month-long conflict to 17. And as I mentioned before, that happened just the day after 2 American service members were killed during an attack in Jordan. They also said that 1 other service member had been categorized as missing in action. They provided a bit more of an update there as well, saying that remains were found in that area, but the examination process, the verification process is still ongoing. CENTCOM is still withholding some information here as they are working to make sure that next of kin is notified. But all of this happening as there are fears that this could turn into a much wider conflict. The U.S. has launched 8 consecutive nights of strikes, and then there have been waves of Iranian drones and missiles fired at a widening number of targets in countries with U.S. bases. Omar?
And Nick, what has the reaction in the region been like to these latest strikes?
Yeah, we're hearing about some levels of diplomacy, the Saudis, others talking about how this current sort of spate of conflict can avoid an escalation. If we go back to what was happening at the end of March, in the early part of April, in the very beginning of the sort of ceasefire back then, these Gulf countries got very worried when it appeared that the United States was about to step up military actions again as it was trying to sort of force open the Strait of Hormuz. And what they didn't understand back then was precisely what the United States was planning. And you get a sense that some of that's permeating the region again. Bahrain today intercepting missiles fired at it. Kuwait, as you mentioned, intercepting missiles fired at it again. They've really been caught in some of the most direct and intense barrages coming from Iran so far. But it really, I think it is Israel and Jordan where we've seen this possibility of a real increase in the scale and potential scope of the current hostilities. And that's quite simply because Iran today targeted the southern Jordanian port city of Aqaba. And just a couple of hours before that, the U.S. embassy in Jordan had warned Americans, don't go to Aqaba International Airport, don't go to Aqaba seaport there, because there is credible information about the possibility of attack. Now, Jordanian officials said they weren't aware of that, but within a couple of hours, 4 missiles came from Iran, 3 were intercepted, 1 fell in a deserted area. But during this, because Aqaba is right next to Eilat, Israel's port city at the top of the Red Sea, they both sit there at the top of the Red Sea side by side. Israel activated its air defense systems, and indeed the IDF say that they were involved in helping bring down the attack on southern Jordan. And why this causes concern: as far as we know, there are no U.S. military bases around Aqaba. Aqaba is very busy for tourists at this time of year. Jordan has really been caught in Iran's crosshairs a lot over recent days, not just the killing of several U.S. service members there over the past few days, but multiple different bases U.S. Air Force operates out of in Jordan. The Iranians claim to have attacked. So this appears to be an escalation, and easy to see how the spillover can happen. And Israel's defense minister today said clearly, if Iran attacks, Israel will respond automatically. That's the sort of escalation everyone in this region wants to avoid.
Yeah, Nick Robertson, Julia Benbrook, really appreciate the reporting on both fronts. I want to talk about this more with CNN military analyst, retired Air Force Colonel Cedric Layton. And look, we are seeing more U.S. troops killed, and this war does seem to be intensifying. If it continues to escalate, what might that actually look like in terms of a next step here?
Omar, it really depends on if the strategies stay the same. But the basic idea would be that there would be an expansion of more raids on the southern part of Iran. And those raids could then be expanded to other parts of Iran. I could see, for example, that CENTCOM would probably target installations in and around Tehran. And that would, of course, be going after headquarters of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the military elements, the security services, and frankly, the leadership. So
on up to 3. U.S. Central Command says 1 American service member died yesterday in Iraq during a controlled detonation of a downed Iranian drone, while 2 other U.S. troops were killed on Friday in Jordan from an Iranian attack. This comes as strikes intensify between the United States and Iran, prompting fears that this war could evolve into a wider conflict. I want to bring in CNN's Julia Benbrook, who is traveling with the president this weekend. And Julia, let's just start with what is the latest from the administration right now?
Well, we have not heard publicly from President Donald Trump about these latest developments. As we've been speaking about, he was just at the World Cup final there in MetLife Stadium. He helped with the awards ceremony, and then he'll be heading back to Washington, D.C. soon. But it was just yesterday that U.S. Central Command announced that 2 American service members had been killed during an attack in Jordan. Now, today, they are announcing that another American service member has been killed in action, this time in northern Iraq. I want to pull up this recent statement for you now. They did go into a bit more detail, saying a U.S. service member in northern Iraq was killed in action July 18th during a controlled detonation of unexploded ordnance from a downed Iranian one-way attack drone. A second service member was wounded and continues to receive medical treatment for a minor injury. This brings the total number of U.S. service members killed during this now nearly 5-month-long conflict to 17. And then that attack in Jordan that killed 2 American service members, they also said that 1 service member was categorized as missing in action. They provided a bit more information there as well, saying that remains were found in that area, but the confirmation process is still going on there. So they're looking for more information as they go through that. But when it comes to CENTCOM, they're withholding some information at this time as they work to make sure the next of kin is notified. But all of this is coming as there is just major escalation in the region. We have seen 8 nights of strikes by the United States, as well as just waves of Iranian drones and missiles that have been fired at a widening number of targets in countries with U.S. bases. So a lot of questions about what's next here. After the attack in Jordan, Trump did give a few brief phone interviews with various outlets. He told the New York Post that he would speak to the families of those that were killed. He also told News Nation that this is a very sad thing. It's in service to our country, and added what he's been saying throughout this conflict, that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon.
All right, Julia Benbrook, appreciate the reporting for us there in New Jersey. We're joined now by CNN national security analyst Alex Plitzis. He's also director of the Counterterrorism Project at the Atlantic Council. Alex, what is your assessment of where things stand tonight?
So unfortunately, from what I'm hearing from multiple U.S. officials, the number of U.S. wounded is actually far more significant than those killed, which was just mentioned. So in Jordan, it could have been as many as 30. I'm also hearing that U.S. bases in Saudi Arabia and also in Iraq were also hit, and that also storage points for weapons in Iraq may have also been hit. So it seems like the attacks may have actually had damage that have been let on publicly yet by the administration.
Just in the last few minutes, U.S. Central Command says a new wave of airstrikes is underway against Iran. This is the 9th consecutive night, and it comes after CENTCOM reported a U.S. service member was killed in northern Iraq during the controlled detonation of a downed Iranian drone. This brings the total to 17 American service members killed in the nearly 5-month war. I want to bring in our panel, CNN political commentator and Democratic strategist Maria Cardona, and Republican strategist and former White House spokesperson during the George W. Bush administration, Pete Seat.
Because the conflict between the U.S. and Iran is moving closer to exploding into an all-out regional war. U.S. President Donald Trump threatened retaliation for the deaths of 3 American service members killed over the weekend. And this is what he posted. Every time Iran kills an American soldier, they will pay for that killing many times over. Now, the 2 sides exchanged yet another round of fresh strikes, with Tehran attacking Jordan, Bahrain, and Kuwait. On the heels of an Iranian attack on Saturday, the Kuwaiti military says intercepted hostile targets twice today. Badr al-Saif is a professor of history at Kuwait University. He's also associate fellow at Chatham House, a well-known face from the show. Badr, great to have you back on the show. Look, we have seen, as we were just outlining there, Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, among the regional countries being targeted in this latest round of Iranian retaliation. Just speak to this moment, first of all, and what is being felt across the region. Because in the last few hours, we have heard from the US president saying that they plan to send additional F-16s and F-35 fighter jets and aerial refueling tankers to the Middle East. What does this signal to you?
Isa, daily attacks for the past week on various Gulf states from Iran and continuous jabs between Iran and the US. The escalation is felt gradually on the ground. Only today, actually, we had a third attack a few hours ago on top of the earlier two that you reported on. And what happened today and yesterday is slightly different from previous attacks because it came in the daytime. And that speaks to the vastness of this conflict and the different ways in which they can go ahead and escalate as they move forward. Now, it's tempting to say that we're back to the height of conflict, the 40 days of war that we had prior to the supposed ceasefire. But let me tell you, the daily averages, the missiles, the drone attacks have increased in scope on Kuwait, on Bahrain, and on Jordan, as much as they have also from the other side towards Iran. So I think we need to consider all of this together. I know that the mediators in other countries are now actively working behind the scenes to get the two countries together, or to at least pause so that we can have some breathing space to move on to a more of a negotiated settlement. But everything is up in the air. We've yet to see how that unfolds.
Yeah, and I can only imagine, Badr, just the nervousness and the anxiety that this is causing. I remember the last time you and I spoke, I think it was before the Memorandum of Understanding, which doesn't seem to be longer existing, was written. You said, and correct me if I'm wrong if you remember this, you said the Gulf countries ought to be leading their own diplomacy. As the conflict potentially continues to expand here, are you seeing individual countries reaching out? Are you seeing diplomacy on that side, or are they waiting for United States to lead a diplomatic front with Pakistan as mediators?
Look, yes and no. We certainly urgently need a new game plan to safeguard our countries in the Gulf.
Yeah.
And we definitely shouldn't count on the US to do our bidding. We should go and talk directly to Iran. Some of the Gulf countries have been doing that already. And it seems that this has been sparing them the worst of the conflict so far. And I think this is important because, look, the claims and the counterclaims that are coming through as they are attacking Kuwait and Bahrain, for example, and Jordan, is that there are attacks coming from our lands towards them. Those are claims that we have denied, or that the governments of the region have denied vehemently. So I think both sides need to lay out their cards, and they need to talk to Iran to understand how we can deal with the region moving forward. I think the other issue that's been holding up the talks between Kuwait and GC operatives last month, what the Kuwaiti authorities have spoken about as IRGC operatives, the other side claims otherwise. But I think holding them has been bringing the ire of Iran towards Kuwait. So those are certainly bargaining chips that could be used in our coming discussions with Iran. Look, at the end of the day, we're interconnected. Geography has its limits. In this case, the cursive geography is very evident. We're very next to each other. Kuwait is only 50 miles away by sea from Iran, and we're flat spaces. So it's very easy to come about and attack the country. We're also surrounded by Iraq, which unfortunately is home to various networks and militias that are supportive of Iran's war effort. So that only increases the stress points on Kuwait. And that's why we need to have that holistic approach towards the Iran file, looking at the various cards that we can bring to the table to discuss the matters with them directly.
Very briefly, Bud, I mean, you mentioned Kuwait. We've seen, of course, it talks about Iraq. But why Jordan? I mean, it's east of Israel, west of Iraq. Why target Jordan? Because it's further to Iran than other targets in the Gulf. What do you make of that?
Look, I make two things. First, they'll extend the same claim that there are U.S. military assets attacking them from Jordan. So that's one. But I think by Iran attacking Jordan, as it is attacking Kuwait, it's sending signals to the neighbors. So with the Kuwait attacks, it's sending signals to the other Gulf states, and it's foreshadowing what's to come in the day after, that they are here, they're there to stand, and they will stand for their rights no matter what, and they will use all measures to do that. In terms of Jordan, I think they're sending signals to Israel that don't think that you're off the hook. Jordan is next to you. We're attacking it. You saw how the Aqaba attack today caused some alarms in Israel. And I think it's also sending that message towards that part of the world, and that we're not only seeing attacks to nearby sites like the Gulf states, but that they can extend beyond that.
In other news, and a threat of retribution from the President of the United States is among the many fast-moving developments, fueling fears of a wider war breaking out across the Middle East. President Trump posted this online message earlier. Let me show it to you. Every time Iran kills an American soldier, they will pay for that killing many times over. And it follows the death of 3 American service members over the weekend. 2 were killed in Jordan, a 3rd died in Iraq. Most of what we know so far about their deaths has been attributed to anonymous officials, as Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth maintains chokehold on information during the war. Kevin Liptak joins me now. So Kevin, just bring us up to date with the very latest here, because we have seen from the US signs of stepping up of pressure on Iran, while the death toll is increasing the number of service personnel. How much pressure does this put on President Trump to bring this to a conclusion?
I think it puts an enormous amount of pressure on him. Remember, previously, he had said that if Iran killed American servicemen, that he could potentially start the war again. Now, what's happening now certainly looks like a war, but I think the implication was that he could perhaps intensify the American engagement there. We know that behind the scenes, the president is hearing options for perhaps widening this conflict. And I learned today that American fighter jets are now heading to the Middle East, more of them, F-16s and F-35s, all coming from bases in Europe, as well as aerial refueling tankers, which I think is giving the president options should he decide to go in the direction of a more intense engagement going forward. But I think in reality, the number of palpable or palatable options are kind of dwindling for the president. There are all kinds of economic pressures, political pressures to not become engaged any further. And I think that's weighing on him as well. And this has, I think, when you really look at it, been one of the deadliest stretches of days for American troops since the war began more than 4 months ago. And it seems likely to rise. In addition to the 2 troops that died in that attack on an airbase in Jordan, the military is also examining unidentified remains that were found at the scene. And so it seems likely that the death toll will continue to tick up. And I think it has led to fears that you hear among American officials that, one, Iran seems to have been able to reconstitute some of the missile and drone capabilities that the president has been saying for so long have been completely decimated. But as well, they seem to be able to evade American air defenses in a way that they weren't previously, suggesting that they have learned certain capacities over the course of this war, which I think will factor into the president's decision-making as he decides what to do going forward. You also hear from diplomats who are involved in this the idea that perhaps they could return eventually to the negotiating table. We heard from Marco Rubio, the American Secretary of State, overnight, saying that they had received indications from the Iranians that they do have an interest in getting back to these talks. Now, tomorrow evening, the president will attend the dignified transfer of the remains of those fallen American servicemen and women up at Dover Air Force Base. That, I think, a very solemn moment that will just reinforce to him the responsibility that's on his shoulders as Commander-in-Chief as he decides how to proceed.
Breaking news from the White House on the war with Iran. We're learning that President Trump will attend a dignified transfer tomorrow after at least 3 U.S. service members were killed over the weekend. Earlier, the Pentagon identified 2 of the soldiers killed in an attack in Jordan as 25-year-old First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan of Hawaii, but his father tells CNN he primarily lived in Georgia, and Private Isabella Gonzalez of Texas, who was just 19 years old. CNN's Kevin Liptak is live for us at the White House. Kevin, tell us what you're learning.
Right, and this has really been one of the deadliest stretch of days for American forces since this war began more than 4 months ago, ratcheting up the costs for Americans, but also, I think, deepening the quandary for President Trump as he tries to determine where this will all go now. And the death toll, I should note, is likely to rise. The military says that it is still examining unidentified remains that were found at the site of the attack at a base in Jordan where those 2 other service members were killed. We also learned this weekend about an additional American service member who was killed in northern Iraq during a controlled detonation of an unexploded Iranian drone. Now, President Trump is vowing retribution. He wrote on Truth Social earlier today that, quote, every time Iran kills an American soldier, they will pay for that killing many times over. And he said that he had passed that directive on to top military brass. We do know that the president is considering options for widening this conflict. He has said previously that if Iran killed U.S. troops, that he would consider going back to war with that country, although the current situation doesn't really look all that different from war. I think if you're an ordinary person just observing what is happening. Today, I'm told by a U.S. official that the U.S. is ramping up firepower in the region, sending F-16 and F-35 fighter jets from bases to from Europe to the Middle East, and also deploying additional aerial refueling bombers as well, those refueling tankers, as the U.S. considers perhaps an escalation here. At the same time, you also hear talk potentially of trying to resume some of the diplomacy. The American Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying overnight that the U.S. remains willing to negotiate with Iran if that door opens, and saying that the U.S. had received both indirect and direct communications from the Iranians that they were, again, open to talking. But again, that moment tomorrow as the president observes the dignified transfer up at Dover, certainly, I think, reiterating for him the weight of responsibility as he decides his next course of action in this conflict. Brianna.
All right, Kevin Liptak live for us at the White House. Boris?
Let's get some perspective now with former Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall. He's the author of Lethal Autonomy, the Future of Warfare, Whether We Like It or Not. Secretary, thanks so much for being with us. First, just your reaction to the deaths of these service members and the president's vow of retribution to make Iran pay.
First of all of our hearts go out to the families, teammates, friends of the people that we've lost. Every loss is a tragedy. These are particularly so, because we're in an unnecessary conflict, and we don't seem to have a good way out of it right now. As you heard, they're increasing the air assets going into the theater. That suggests additional escalation. Donald Trump has put himself in a box, and there's no easy way for him to get out of it. He initiated this war thinking there'd be a very quick victory, and that's not what's happened. And what I think has been missing in his mind is the understanding of the Iranian regime's willingness to resist and their intent to achieve their own objectives. And that's what he's confronted with. He doesn't have control of the situation, and that's very, very obvious right now.
On the fact that the U.S. is moving assets into the region, they're planning to send additional F-16, F-35 fighter jets, as well as aerial refueling tanks. What options does that open up for the Pentagon?
Basically, continued and additional airstrikes. Now, the president's been threatening to attack infrastructure and so on, and we've seen some of that already. Most of the attacks, as we understand it, have been against military targets. The problem we have is that Iran has dispersed its assets, it's concealed them, it's hardened them in some cases, and they're tactical assets. They're really hard to get at. You can't keep continuous air presence everywhere, over, around, all the time. It just can't be done. So their ability to attack assets in the Strait of Hormuz is continuous and has not diminished meaningfully. And until that does happen, they'll be able to control the strait. We don't have a good answer to that. It's a very foreseeable problem that the president should have understood, should have been advised about before he started this war. We can escalate. We can go after other targets. As one of your earlier guests said, that's a war crime. But that doesn't seem to have constrained this president very much. And so he can do that and inflict greater pain on Iran. I think it's unknown how much they're willing to accept to make their point that they want to control the Straits of Hormuz.
Yeah, Tehran is striking civilian infrastructure, conversely, across the Gulf, including water treatment plants, civilian airports, as well as air capabilities in terms of detection. Do you think that risks driving a wedge between these Gulf allies and the United States?
Oh, I think that's the intent, is to extract a price from other countries in the region and discourage them from supporting the United States. There's also some indications that the war will widen, that the Houthis will now be trying to close the Red Sea, basically, to Saudi Arabia and prevent their shipments out by that alternative route. So we don't see a good outcome anywhere in sight at this point. I've been saying from day one on this that there was a risk that Iran would overplay its hand. I think that's what they're doing. They can't get much more out of President Trump than he's already willing to concede. And they should recognize that and cut a deal with him. But that doesn't seem to be the path they're on. And Trump is left with very few options but to escalate and try to convince them that it's time to do a deal. So that's where we are.
So in your eyes, it's far more likely that we get a serious escalation well before there's any kind of resumed ceasefire or even a more lasting deal?
I can't put a percentage on that.
Sure.
It's impossible to predict. The Iranians have their own way of looking at the situation. I can't really get inside their heads. It's not the transactional approach that our president brings to the table. They've gone way beyond, that. And so I think the big surprise for him has been their willingness, their resilience, their willingness to accept punishment, and their continuing attempts to demonstrate that they can control the Straits and to not give us the kind of limitations on their nuclear program we'd like to have. The president, on the other hand, can't go to a situation which is such a clear loss as a worse situation than one he had before he started this war. So we're in a box. They're both in a box. Hopefully the Iranians will come to the point of view that they've accomplished what they can and cut a deal. That's what we need to see happen.
So start this hour following breaking news on President Trump's military options in Iran after 3 U.S. service members were killed over the weekend. A U.S. official tells CNN that more U.S. fighter jets and additional resources will soon be heading to the Middle East. Earlier, President Trump posting, quote, "Every time Iran kills an American soldier, they will pay for that killing many times over." Last hour, we learned he will attend a dignified transfer at Dover Air Base tomorrow. The Pentagon has now identified 2 soldiers killed in Jordan as 25-year-old First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan of Hawaii. His father tells CNN he primarily lived in Georgia, and Private Isabella Gonzalez of Texas, who was just 19 years old. CNN's Kristen Holmes is live for us at the White House. Kristen, what more can you share?
Well, it seems as though President Trump is considering widening that war against Iran. We've seen an obvious escalation on both sides. Central Command posting that they had completed this morning their 9th round of consecutive strikes in Iran. And both sides, as we've seen, seem more willing to go after those sensitive civilian locations. Now, President Trump, as you noted, has been angry about these deaths of these troops. He is attending that dignified transfer. But even as we are seeing this escalation, this idea of diplomacy is still one that is being discussed, even among his top staffers and his top deputies. This is Secretary of State Marco Rubio discussing this while he was on his latest trip.
I think we're always open to diplomacy. It has to be real. It has to be a deal that they're willing to live by. Look, Iran a week ago was supposed to put out a statement saying that the Straits of Hormuz would be open, that they would no longer attack shipping. And instead of doing that, they attacked 3 ships. I think that was last Friday or Saturday. So, I mean, their behavior has to change in order for ours to change.
Well, and as President Trump is weighing all of his various options, we have learned that the U.S. is sending over various aircrafts to the Middle East. Some of these coming from European bases. That includes F-16s, F-35s, as well as those in the air refueling tankers. But one thing to keep in mind here, this is not something the White House wants to be dealing with, an escalating war in Iran. He had been looking for any kind of diplomatic off-ramp, and part of that is likely due to the polling that we have seen. Americans are largely not in favor of this war. We are heading into a midterm. This is the most recent poll we have seen that shows that 68% of the Americans believe that the war in Iran was, quote, not worth fighting, with only 28% saying that it was. Boris?
President Donald Trump is issuing a new threat to Iran as war escalates across the Middle East. The president posting this afternoon, quote, every time Iran kills an American soldier, they will pay for that killing many times over, end quote.
We feel very badly, but you know, those great people, those great patriots were out there fighting that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Iran has been very, very badly damaged. They've lost everything almost militarily. They've got very little evidence.
The president's latest threat coming after a weekend in which the United States and Iran traded deadly airstrikes with Iranian missile and drone attacks, killing at least 3 American service members. This morning, the Pentagon identified 2 soldiers killed in that deadly Iranian missile strike on an airbase in Jordan. Private Isabella Gonzalez of Texas was just 19 years old when she was killed on Friday. And First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan of Georgia and Hawaii died on Saturday. He was 25 years old. A third, yet unidentified service member was killed in northern Iraq. A 4th is missing in Jordan. Those deaths, the first for the U.S. since March.
You said at the start of the war it would be 4 or 5 weeks. Well, you keep hitting me. This is a far bigger job that we're doing. We were doing a little job of stopping them from having a certain capability. Now we're just ending it. So it's really not the same thing. What we're doing now is we're ending any chance where they can have a nuclear missile. If you look at it, after a week and a half, not 4 weeks, a week and a half, 2 weeks, we stopped them from probably, but I don't want to have the word probably. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
All right, let's get off the sidelines, head into the arena. My panel is here, along with CNN senior White House correspondent Kristen Holmes. Kristen, always good to see you. What are you hearing from the White House about what's next?
Well, right now, President Trump seems to be focused just on payback when it comes to Iran. Now, we did just learn moments ago that mediators have floated this idea of a 10-day ceasefire, but the U.S. is playing down any prospect of President Trump actually agreeing to the ceasefire. And just to give you an idea of what one U.S. official told our Kevin Liptak, said right now President Trump is focused on making Iran pay for their violation of the MOU and their continued acts of terrorism in the Strait of Hormuz. Again, not referring to whether or not he would receive or even take part in any kind of ceasefire. Now, as we have noted, President Trump is now actually considering widening the war on Iran. As he is weighing his various options, the U.S. is sending more military aircrafts to the Middle East from European Air Force bases. That includes F-16s, F-35s, as well as these aerial refueling tankers. We have seen nothing but an escalation between these two sides. But when it comes to this potential, this floated idea of a ceasefire, this would be to lessen the tensions that we are seeing, specifically as we've seen both sides more willing to go after civilian infrastructure. Now, part of this ceasefire, which is unclear how far along this proposal is, would include lifting some of those restrictions on the Strait of Hormuz, which has been really the focal point of all of this, but it still is very unclear what President Trump's next move is. You're going to see a lot more angst, a lot more anger, specifically coming off of a weekend in which the United States lost more troops.
The U.S. and Iran inching closer to an all-out regional war. Concerns are growing. The conflict may be entering a dangerous new phase, one that can't be easily contained. Both sides carried out a 9th straight night of escalatory strikes, and they are expanding their attack targets, including civilian infrastructure relied on by millions of people. It comes as the Pentagon reveals the identities of 2 soldiers killed during Iranian strikes in Jordan on Friday. Those repeated attacks on the more distant regional U.S. allies, perhaps proving Iran still maintains offensive capabilities despite months of American strikes. Meantime, on Sunday, we learned of another American soldier that had been killed, this time in northern Iraq. We're also learning additional American firepower is headed to the region as well. CNN's Kevin Liptak joins us live now from the White House. I think it's fair to say that this administration really underestimated the resilience of Iran and their sort of staying power through this war. Just walk us through that. Why was this a nation that was so underestimated back on February 28th?
Well, I think President Trump was convinced by advisors as well as the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel that perhaps this war would be much more decisive than it was as it has turned out to be. You know, I think the president thought, as his own video the day the war began suggested, that the Iranian regime would fall relatively quickly, that the U.S. would be able to seriously degrade the missile and drone capabilities, including along the Strait of Hormuz. But the thing that they didn't seem to factor in was that Iran would close the strait and view it as leverage going forward. And you have seen ever since the war move away from its original strategic objectives, which was to degrade Iran's nuclear ambitions, and move much more towards the strait and trying to reopen it. And now you see, as the president considers widening the conflict again, that remains the area of focus. And you've seen the Central Command over the last 9 nights go after facilities along the strait to try and wear down Iran's ability to launch those missiles and drones towards not only commercial vessels in the strait, but also towards American military installations in the region. And you're right, I think it's just clearly a lack of awareness of what Iran might be willing to do in order to wait the U.S. out in terms of the conflict. And the president's own plans for how long this would take, he originally said it would be maximum 6 weeks, and now we're well past the 4-month mark. And the deaths of these Americans will provide, I think, another moment for the president to consider what he's going to do now. You know, it does seem to suggest, based on where these attacks happened, that Iran not only retains its missile and drone capabilities, but also seems more able to evade American anti-missile defenses than it was earlier on in the conflict, suggesting that they have used the 4 months of war to learn about how the United States is trying to defend its installations in the region. Now, the U.S. at this point does seem like it's preparing for something more escalatory. I'm told that F-16 and F-35 fighter jets from bases in Europe are now heading to the region, along with aerial refueling tankers, which I think gives an indication that the president is preparing for some sort of wider option. But at the same time, you hear the diplomats involved in all of this suggest that there could be still the opportunity to resolve this around the negotiating table. The Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying that the U.S. is getting indications from Iran that it wants to get back to negotiations, although at this point it's hard to detect exactly where those discussions actually are.
Time might exacerbate the situation by disrupting the global oil supply even further. The Iranian-backed group has declared a maritime blockade on Saudi shipping, putting Riyadh's crude exports at risk. The U.S. war with Iran, meantime, may be taking a dangerous new turn as more American firepower is headed to the region. Washington and Tehran engaged in a 9th night of consecutive escalatory strikes, with the U.S. expanding its attacks inside of Iran, and civilian infrastructure is increasingly becoming a target for both sides. In his latest CNN analysis, Stephen Collinson writes, the new U.S. escalation in Iran makes Trump's endgame vacuum more urgent. CNN's Stephen Collinson joins us live now from Washington. So, Stephen, there are some countries in a war where you can continue sort of bombarding them militarily, and eventually they will surrender and capitulate. Iran is obviously not one of those countries. And part of the reason, there's several factors to that. Part of it is the sort of asymmetrical nature of their ability to retaliate. They retaliate against Gulf nations. They also have control over the Strait of Hormuz. And on top of that, their leadership, their sort of political leadership, is built for survival. There's also an ideological element to this as well, where just the very nature, or the very idea of capitulating goes against everything this leadership in Iran, the sort of systems that they've put in place, stands for. So President Trump and the administration here obviously knows this. So the idea of thinking that something's going to be different this time just because they continue bombing for 9 consecutive days and they're sending more firepower to the region, why do they think that's going to make a difference this time?
It's a good point. And if you put everything you just said about Iran against the fact that Trump sees things in life, in business, and in politics in a rather binary fashion, you're either winning or you're losing, you have the ingredients for the current stalemate that we're at. If you look at his interactions with Iran over the last year or so during his second term, the initial negotiations on the nuclear program before the raids last year on Iranian nuclear sites, then again earlier this year before the war, and now after the memorandum of understanding has collapsed, it seems like Trump believes that by increasing military force, he can improve the U.S. negotiating position. The problem with that is it repeatedly seems to be the case that it doesn't work. He got what he declared was one of the greatest deals in the history of the Middle East in the memorandum of understanding, and it collapsed within a few days. But all through this conflict, it doesn't seem that the administration has had a very strong sense of history of exactly what motivates the Iranians. The memorandum of understanding was, after all, based on the idea that runs through the Trump foreign policy that at some point everybody can be bought off with financial riches. And as you say, there are ideological and historical and political reasons why that clearly isn't the case with Iran. The administration doesn't seem to be seeing that. And I think the question is now is how long Trump sticks with this escalation, having failed to explain to Americans and the rest of the world why this tactic of aerial bombardment will be any more successful than it was in the earlier stages of this war.
And just in terms of, I think there are key lessons that the Americans are going to walk away from this war with when it eventually ends. I mean, at the beginning, I was speaking to Kevin Liptek about this. At the beginning of this war on February 28th, they clearly underestimated Iran's sort of staying power, just the sheer level of resilience. This is a country that has a different level of tolerance for casualties, different level of tolerance for, widespread destruction in their country. And so when this war is said and done, and obviously President Trump has talked about how difficult, from his perspective, the Iranians are to negotiate with. Obviously, the Iranians would say the same thing, of course, about the Americans. But when this war is said and done, what do you think is going to be the biggest takeaway for the Americans? What would be the biggest lesson that they, I guess, should have learned?
Well, it would seem to be the same lesson of Vietnam, of Afghanistan, of Iraq, is that what the assumptions are about an adversary in Washington, their staying power, their motivations, their political desires are often completely out of step with what the force on the ground, which the opposing government, actually the characteristics of that opposing government. That seems to be a lesson that was pretty well drummed into Washington with the failure of the Iraq and Afghan wars, which only, let's face it, ended a few years ago after massive, long military engagements. Trump has seemed to believe that he can get around all that by a vigorous aerial bombardment without ground troops, without being sucked into a quagmire. But that has failed here. I think ultimately, politically, the way this will probably shape out, as it often does, is in more isolationism in the United States, more concern by American voters about getting sucked into foreign wars, which is rather ironic since that was at the center of Trump's platform in 2016 and even in 2020. And that's still something, that reticence about foreign adventures that sits very deeply, I think, in the American political DNA in the 21st century. Yet at the same time, there is this constant temptation for presidents to demonstrate power and to try to implement what they see as U.S. interests by the use of force. They're constantly being dragged into conflict.
President Trump is weighing his options for what comes next in Iran as the human cost of this war increases with each passing week. The Pentagon identified 2 American soldiers killed in Jordan on Friday. Another soldier was killed in northern Iraq over the weekend. Trump called their deaths a shame and then had this to say.
Well, we feel very badly, but you know, those great people, those great patriots were out there fighting that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon.
Jordan, meantime, is coming under increasing fire. Attacks on the regional U.S. ally, which is further away from Tehran than the Gulf nations, is perhaps proof that Iran still maintains offensive capabilities despite months of American attacks. CNN's Nick Robertson joins us live now from Jerusalem. I think that the resilience and the sheer sort of staying power is something that may have caught the Americans off guard when they started this war back at the end of February. Just walk us through what a diplomatic off-ramp, though, at this point in time looks like, Nick.
It looks very difficult, and it's hard to see. At the moment, there is the Iranian Interior Minister meeting with his Pakistani counterpart, who's one of the main mediators between the US and Iran. It's not clear what they're going to talk about, whether or not they can push forward the opportunity for an off-ramp. It just doesn't seem to be there. The information that we get that the United States is bringing in more F-35 fighter jets, more F-16 fighter jets, more KC-135 Stratotanker refuelers for those fighter jets is an indication that this war is going to continue, and it may continue at a bigger pace. There's the real risk of overspill. The tensions between the Houthis, who are widely seen as a proxy for Iran, and Saudi Arabia are sort of reaching an all-time high at the moment because of the Houthis' apparent intention, potential intention to shut down the Red Sea as a means of getting oil, Saudi oil, out of the Gulf region and to international markets. So the tensions are rising there as well. The picture that's being painted here, and you raised it there, of the capabilities that Iran has to continue the war, and it's demonstrated that this past week in Jordan, particularly hitting, it claims, a number of air bases, it claims destroying a number of aircraft, and as we know, killing at least two United States service personnel there. It demonstrates not just that they have obviously the capability and the intent, but one of the things that they have that's become very important is the real-time satellite intelligence, very precise, optically very, very clear, giving them a very clear image of what they're trying to hit on the ground. And the message to the United States is, you might be able to move your aircraft around or bring additional aircraft in, but we can still target them. And the message, obviously, to the Gulf states of Kuwait and Bahrain, which have been taking a huge amount of attacks. Kuwait, again, for the second time today, air raid sirens going off again there in the past few hours, is seeing a significant amount of infrastructure damage. It's not clear what, if is being hit in Bahrain or if it's all being intercepted, but that's certainly coming in for multiple strikes each day. So the diplomatic off-ramp in that context, even though you have the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman and the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio saying they're open to discussions, the channels are there, they're also both saying that the memorandum of understanding that was the diplomatic off-ramp, that's on the sidelines. It's not being used. So it's very hard to see where this finds an exit from the military essential escalation at the moment.
States launching attacks on Iran for a 9th straight day, as a 3rd U.S. service member is confirmed killed since Friday. 2 service members died in an Iranian attack on an air base in Jordan, while a 3rd died in Iraq. 1 service member is still missing in action. Iran is also continuing its attacks, including this one in Kuwait. It has now struck 7 countries, Arab Gulf nations in the region. With the U.S. Now joining us now is Ambassador Dennis Ross. He was a special assistant to President Obama on the Middle East peace process and is a counselor over at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Dennis, thanks so much for joining us. Do you expect there will be larger fallout from the deaths of these U.S. service members? Is this war with Iran now going to dramatically escalate?
I don't know that it's going to dramatically escalate, although it's clear the U.S. is moving F-15s and F-35s to the region, is also moving additional aerial refueling tankers. So that suggests we're probably going to increase the scope and intensity of the attacks we're going to carry out. The Iranians, as you just noted, have hit 7 different states in the region. So there is a dynamic here that seems to be an escalatory one, but it's also noteworthy that A, the Iranians are not hitting Israel, which suggests they know that Israel would hit back in a big way. B, the United States is still not hitting certain kinds of targets, meaning we're not hitting power plants, we're not going after energy facilities. And I think the reason for that is we're seeing that the Iranians have the ability to hit similar kinds of targets in the Gulf states. I think when they hit Kuwait and they hit the desalination plant, an electricity related facility, an oil related facility, that was their way of signaling, if you hit these kinds of targets within Iran, we will hit those kinds of targets in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and elsewhere, and the impact on oil prices will be dramatic. So I think there is still a conflict that is being fought within certain bounds. Wolf, the basic problem is there's no way out of the current impasse because the Iranians are insisting they will control the straits, and we're saying they will not.
The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, says the U.S. is still open to diplomacy with Iran. Iranian officials say they were also open to it. But how does diplomacy even restart at this point with this war escalating?
Well, it's not unusual to have force and diplomacy operate at the same time. Oftentimes, each side is using force to try to affect the terms of a negotiation. I think that's what we're seeing at this point. I think both sides actually would like to find a way out. Our reimposition of the blockade has dramatically damaged further an already desperate economy within Iran. The IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard leadership, may speak strongly and boldly about how that's not going to affect them, but the truth is it does have an effect on them. But the same is true here. The president is clearly sensitive to the idea of oil prices going dramatically higher. Each side would like to find a way out, but neither side wants to look like it's backing down. It's in that context that you have mediators like the Qataris offering new proposals that start with a 10-day ceasefire, and then you come up with what might be some new mechanisms that involve many of the states in the region as part of the management of the straits. Each side is going to need some way out. The one thing from an American standpoint that I think is essential, Iran cannot be in control of the Straits of Hormuz when all this ends. Let's recall, Wolf, that on February 27th, the straits were open. Supposedly our main objective was about preventing Iran from ever having a nuclear weapon, but our whole focus right now seems to be on reopening the straits, which, by the way, were open prior to the war.
How deep, Dennis, are the fractures within Iran's regime right now? We still haven't seen, as you know, the new supreme leader. He was injured. His father was killed in the opening days of the war. Are we even sure who is in charge right now?
Historically, I would just note that we've always seen factions within the Iranian elite. That's not new. But the supreme leader was always the arbiter and always the decision maker. Right now, we don't know what the real status of the supreme leader is. He hasn't been seen. Statements are issued. They're probably written by others. I think what we're seeing is a kind of balance of power where maybe the supreme leader has some role, but there's probably a balance of power where the dominant voice at this point is really reflecting the Revolutionary Guard. But I do think the president, Pezeshkian, the Speaker of the Parliament, Ghalibaf, I think they are part of the decision-making process. It still seems that the Revolutionary Guard has greater sway. But again, there's a kind of balance of power at this point, favoring one side a little bit more. The longer this goes on, the greater the pressures from within, given what's happening to the economy. I still think we'll see an interest on their part to find a way out. The problem is they think they can outlast President Trump. And that's really, I think, why we're seeing the dynamic we are right now.
As you know, Israel says it will respond and respond militarily to any future attack from Iran or its proxies for that matter. What does Israel want right now? How do you see it?
Well, I think there's what the prime minister wants in terms of the politics of the situation. And I think he would still like to be able to inflict much more damage on the Iranian ballistic missile capability, its inventories, and the like. But he's not in a position to make decisions. It's the President of the United States who's making the decisions. And I think the President, at this point, doesn't seem to want the Israelis to be involved. It's ironic that the Iranians don't seem to want the Israelis to be involved. The only way the Israelis become involved is if the President changes his mind and or the Iranians hit Israel. At this point, they're avoiding that. So I still think, even though within Israel, I think there's a strong sense that something could happen this week where Israel is drawn in, my sense at this point is that basically neither the United States nor the Iranians seem to want the Israelis involved, because I still think there's a desire, at least on the part of the President, to keep this more limited. I think we're going to see him try to strike a balance where he's going to do much more this week in the hopes that by hitting the Iranians even harder with the blockade, they will come around and look for a way out. Now, whether we can get to that point right now, given the kind of zero-sum quality of each side wanting an outcome that the other can't really live with, that remains to be seen. But I still think we're seeing each side operate within certain limits. And the mediators may come up with something as things begin to look worse that allows each side to take a step back. That, I think, is the hope for the moment.
News we're following. CNN has learned that the United States is now sending more fighter aircraft to the Middle East as fighting clearly escalates in the war with Iran. A U.S. official tells CNN that fighter jets and aerial refueling tankers will be pulled from bases in Europe. Meanwhile, a third U.S. service member has been confirmed killed, and it happened Sunday in northern Iraq while they were trying to detonate a downed Iranian attack drone. 2 other service members were killed Friday in an Iranian attack on an airbase in Jordan, and another service member is still missing in action. The total number of U.S. troop fatalities in this war has now climbed to 17.
Well, we feel very badly, but you know, those great people, those great patriots were out there fighting that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Iran has been very, very badly damaged. They've lost everything almost militarily.
But Iran is clearly proving it can still hit back, expanding its strikes to 7 Gulf Arab countries across the region. Here you see smoke rising from an oil facility in Kuwait after repeated attacks. Let's go live right now to CNN senior White House correspondent Kristen Holmes. Kristen, what are you learning this morning? What else is going on?
Well, Wolf, we're clearly seeing a lot of escalating tension, a lot of escalating back and forth between the U.S. and Iran. And sources say President Trump is considering all of his options, including widening the war against Iran. As you noted, this will involve, while he weighs those options, the U.S. sending over more aircrafts to the Middle East. That includes F-16s, F-32s, and those refueling aerial tankers. Now, we've seen back and forth here that has, as we've noted, really gone after more targets and seemingly put negotiations into a rearview mirror. We saw Central Command saying that it finished up its 9th day of these consecutive strikes in Iran, and that's not stopping U.S. diplomats and negotiators from saying that there's still a diplomatic approach on the table. This is the Secretary of State Marco Rubio talking about that.
You can't have an MOU that's alive if they're violating the terms of it. What I will say is that the United States always remains open to a diplomatic solution. We've tried multiple times with Iran, and we'll continue to try. If that door opens, we'll be happy to see it open. They continue to send signals that they want to talk, that they want to negotiate, but their behavior is what we're responding to. And their behavior is they're launching missiles and drones against ships, including tonight.
And now we're seeing both sides really escalating their attacks on sensitive civilian infrastructure. And I do want to talk quickly about those U.S. troops killed. I know you walked through them. We know in northern Iraq there was 1 service member killed and another wounded. In Jordan, 2 U.S. troops killed in action, 1 service member missing in action. There have been remains that were found but not yet identified. And this is also raising a lot of alarm bells as to whether or not Iran is figuring out how to get around the U.S. air defenses. Remember, one of the big sticking points for so many Americans and even Republicans who support President Trump was not losing more U.S. troops. Obviously, we've had one of the most deadly stretches here in the last few days that we've seen really since early on in the war.
All right, Kristen Holmes at the White House for us. Thank you very much. Also this morning, the Defense Department identified the 2 U.S. service members killed in Jordan. First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan was from Eva Beach in Hawaii. He was stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. First Lieutenant Feehan was 25 years old. And Private Isabella Gonzalez was from Carrollton, Texas. She was stationed in Ansbach, Germany. Private Gonzalez was just 19 years old. My deepest condolences to their families. May they rest in peace and may their memories be a blessing. And joining us here in the Situation Room, retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Cedric Leighton. He's a CNN military analyst. Colonel Leighton, what do we know about the air base, first of all, in Jordan, where these 2 American service members were killed and another now is still missing? We should note that this service member has not yet been found.
Yeah, that's right, Wolf, and of course our condolences to the families of these service members. One of the things that we have to note about this base is the Mufawaq al-Salti base, and it's in about 100 kilometers northeast of Amman, Jordan, the capital, and it's been a base that's been used in the past by the U.S. For various operations, including operations in Iraq when we were conducting the shock and awe phase of Iraqi freedom. This base has been, set aside. Parts of it have been set aside for us by the Jordanians, and it includes right now a whole string of different types of aircraft, including fighter jets like F-35 fighter jets. I believe there are also F-16s there at this point in time. There also are drones there. The MQ-9 Reaper is stationed at Mufawaq al-Salti, and then of course the tankers, the KC-135 tankers. Some of them are stationed there. Of course, there are others that are coming into Israel at this point in time, but Mufawaq al-Salti is a real big node for the U.S. military, both from an Air Force and a naval air perspective, as well as from an Army perspective. So it's a large node for CENTCOM to operate in this part of the Middle East.
And the Iranians are clearly targeting these Gulf Arab nations that normally are not involved in a war with Iran, but they're targeting countries like Iran, Bahrain, Oman, United Arab Emirates, Qatar. These countries are very significant countries in the region, and they're going after them, even infrastructure targets where no U.S. troops are involved.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And the way the Iranians are targeting it, they seem to start, in some respects, with U.S. military bases. Service members at the beginning of it is the Iranians are also going after those civilian infrastructure targets that you mentioned. Those include desalination plants, so those include airports, and of course, anybody who's flown in and around the Middle East knows that airlines like Emirates and Qatar Airways, those nodes and hubs that they have in those areas are critically important for those airlines, because those airlines have become global players in the aviation industry, and it's a huge impact also on the tourism and on business in general.
And they attacked that commercial airport in Aqaba, the southernmost port of Jordan.
That's right. And Jordan is actually really, not only the base that's north of Aqaba, but Aqaba in that southwestern corner of Jordan touches, actually called the Gulf of Aqaba, touches on the Red Sea. And what that indicates is that the Iranians are not only hitting those areas in Jordan, but they're also sending a signal to Israel, because Eilat, the port city in Israel,
it's right next to Aqaba.
Exactly, is right next to Aqaba. And that also means that it's not that far from those two cities to the Suez Canal. So what the Iranians are signaling is that there is a potential that they will want to shut down the Red Sea transit routes in addition to the Persian Gulf transit routes. So if the Iranians do that, then we've got even more of a mess on our hands, because those two areas are major transit hubs for global trade, not just the oil trade, but basically all goods that are used in international trade come through one of those areas.
But if those Iranian drone and missile strikes go further than Jordan and hit Israel, the Israelis will respond overwhelmingly.
They certainly will, and the Israelis have made that pretty clear. Defense Minister Katz has mentioned it, and obviously Prime Minister Netanyahu has said things about that in the past as well. The Israelis, of course, are going to exercise their right of self-defense, and then we have a situation where we've got basically the U.S. and Israel on one side and Iran on the other, and the Arab states caught more or or less in the middle, both geographically as well as otherwise. And that will become a significant issue for all of them at this point.
Very significant. CNN is learning that the U.S. is planning to send additional F-16 fighter jets, F-35 fighter jets, along with more aerial refueling tankers to the Middle East as these tensions clearly soar. This is pretty significant right now.
It is, and when you look at what we already have in the Gulf region, you've got, of course, carrier strike groups that are in the Arabian Sea, near the Persian Gulf. You've got the aircraft that are already based in areas of the Middle East, including Jordan and Saudi Arabia, as well as the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. So those areas are going to get beefed up, basically. The airplanes that you mentioned, the fighters, as well as the aerial refueling tankers, are also probably going to be augmented by other aircraft such as reconnaissance aircraft and other drones potentially as well. And if all of that moves forward, they'll be coming from Europe, and that will basically set the stage for even further military offensives and basically a military campaign against Iran, one that is even more extensive than what we've seen so far.
Right now, more U.S. fighter jets are headed to the Mideast as President Trump weighs widening the war he began 5 months ago. That's after a dramatic ratcheting up of hostilities over the past few days and the deaths of 3 U.S. service members, the first troops killed in action since March. This morning, the Pentagon identified 2 of the fallen as 25-year-old First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan of Hawaii and 19-year-old Private Isabella Gonzalez of Texas. They were killed in Jordan during an Iranian attack. A third, still unidentified service member died on Saturday in northern Iraq. CNN's Kevin Liptak is at the White House. Kevin, what are you hearing from your sources about where they think this is going to go at this time?
Yeah, and I think you heard from the president himself yesterday, vowing retribution for these Americans' death. And I think behind the scenes, the president has been receiving options from advisors about a potential widening of this conflict, including in the Situation Room last week. And you do see how the United States is now preparing the ground for that potential widening. I'm told by a U.S. official that the U.S. is sending additional aircraft to the region, including F-16 and F-35 fighter jets that are coming from bases in Europe. The U.S. is also sending additional aerial refueling tankers, all for a potential expansion of this conflict. The deaths of those Americans, I do think, underline certainly the risks for American troops in the region, but also the sustained ability of Iran to keep firing missiles and drones at American military installations. And I think when you talk to U.S. officials, there's also fear that this could potentially demonstrate Iran's ability to evade American air defenses, something that perhaps they have learned over the course of this more than 4-month conflict. And so the president, I think, certainly has some decisions to make in front of him. This will really test whatever restraint he was feeling. And, he has said up until this point that he would consider starting the war again if Iran killed American troops. But at the same time, you do hear diplomats involved in all of this say that the door is not closed for negotiations. You saw Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He's traveling in Asia. He told reporters overnight that if Iran was willing to negotiate, that, quote, the door remains open, and that the U.S. had been hearing from Iran both directly and indirectly that it remains open to get back to the negotiating table. And so even as you see this back and forth of attacks, last night was the 9th consecutive night of U.S. attacks on Iran. They're hitting ever more sensitive targets, including desalination plants, roads, and bridges. Even amid all of that, you do see these glimmers of hope that negotiations could potentially prevail, all in the hope that this doesn't cascade out of control.
Welcome, everybody. U.S. Central Command says that it has concluded a 9th consecutive night of strikes against Iran. Explosions were heard in cities across the northwest and coastal areas. Iranian state media reporting that its military also launched missiles toward enemy targets. Kuwait's army says that air defenses are responding to drone threats, and in Bahrain saying that their air raid sirens have been activated. Meanwhile, the U.S. military is reporting the death of another American service member who was killed in northern Iraq during the controlled detonation of a downed Iranian drone. Here's what President Trump had to say about the recent strikes and these troop fatalities.
Well, we feel very badly, but you know, those great people, those great patriots are out there fighting that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Iran has been very, very badly damaged. They've lost everything almost militarily. They've got very little left. They've got some missiles. They've got some drones. They've got some manufacturing ability, not much. We control the strait. They don't control anything. So we'll see what happens, but we hit them very hard again tonight.
Let's go to CNN's Leila Garagozlu live from Abu Dhabi as she continues to cover this. So Leila, give us a sense of where some of these strikes have actually been focused.
Yeah, so as you said, it is the 9th consecutive day of strikes between the U.S. and Iran. The U.S. said that it hit a number of Iranian military targets Sunday night into today, Monday morning. Now, Iranian state media said that there were explosions heard across the southern region of Iran, as well as in the northwestern region of Iran, close to the city of Tabriz. Now, that would be the first time in these 9 days that we're hearing any sort of explosions in that area. Earlier on in this war, in the early months, much of the U.S. and Israeli strikes were focused on the more inland cities like Tehran, Esfahan, and Tabriz. This time around, in these 9 days, these strikes have been really focused on the southern region. Now, the southern region is considered to be Iran's defensive arch. These cities like Bandar Abbas, Ahvaz, and also these islands like Qeshm Island and Harg Island really are part of the way that Iran is able to control the Strait of Hormuz. Now, that's why we're seeing the U.S. really focus its strikes in this southern region. Now, when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz and who controls it, the IRGC says that the Iranians still control it and that they've closed it. The UK Maritime Authority said that it got a report of a vessel on fire, and the Revolutionary Guards said that they had 2 tankers that they found to be non-compliant and therefore targeted. So really asserting their control over the strait. Now, we're in a very fragile situation between the U.S. and Iran, and there's some serious concern among analysts that I've spoken to about this escalating and expanding if no off-ramp is found. So we're going to have to see what happens over the next week. Polo?
All right, Leila Garagozlu, thank you so much for all that reporting. As always, appreciate your time. Let's go now to Nega Anga joining me now. She's a visiting fellow with King's College London, and she was a senior advisor at the U.S. State Department and National Security Council. Thank you so much for joining us, Nega. Great to see you again.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Good morning. So after the U.S. and Iran, they traded strikes for a 9th straight night, as you just heard in Leila's report. Do you see any potential off-ramps right now? I mean, a question that so many are asking, what would de-escalation actually look like?
That's a great question. I mean, look, I think we have to be very realistic. We can't look for some sort of grand political agreement, not even anything close to what the Memorandum of Understanding looked like just a week or so ago. What we need to sort of look for is some sort of emergency operating arrangement for the Hormuz. And I think that's where you're going to have sort of those back channel diplomatic conversations to try to find a solution to essentially the Strait of Hormuz, how it's going to operate, the recognized sort of shipping lanes, who monitors, who clears it, all of those technical details, and essentially kind of like a freeze for freeze sort of approach, so that we move away from, essentially what looks like punishment becoming a strategy. So I do think there is, a small window, and there is that diplomatic off-ramp there. The only sort of disconcerting factor is, there is so much direct military friction right now that this could, this could be a slippery slope into something much larger.
So if, in fact, there are some of those back-channel conversations that you referenced, I'm just curious, who do you think are some of those parties, in addition to the U.S. and Iran? Do you think that some of the Gulf nations would be potentially involved?
Absolutely. The mediators need to continue to stay involved. They have obviously a lot of domestic and personal interest in making sure that the fighting halts. But it's going to require quite a bit of that shuttle diplomacy. They're going to have to be going back and forth between both capitals to try to convince them that they need to come to the table to discuss. The issue is, and it's the idea of trying to convince both parties that you are losing this window of opportunity. Once this window closes, it's going to be very hard to find a diplomatic off-ramp. An off-ramp is always possible. It's just, how do you not lose face in front of your domestic audience? And that window is quite small, both for the United States, but also for Iran, who is under a lot of economic constraints right now. So again, the mediators are going to have to be involved. Mediators can range from, obviously Pakistan, Qatar, and all the other regional countries who are being directly impacted by these volleying attacks taking place over the last week or so.
Let's talk a little bit more about this clear widening of this conflict. We already know that a Kuwaiti power and desalination plant was struck by Iran for the second time, actually, and the U.S. striking Iranian sites like bridges and power stations. So does this targeting of that kind of infrastructure, do you think that it increases the risk for civilians in the region? Is that something that we should now be seriously worried about?
We definitely should be. Again, I think the objectives in some ways have been quite clear, right? On the United States side, the immediate objectives were clear, punish attacks on U.S. personnel, protect commercial shipping, reduce Iran's coastal capacity to control or threaten the strait. So, it's very clear why they have these very specific targeted attacks. A lot of times they see them as, military infrastructure, that are important key sites. For Iran's behavior, it's very clear that they're basically saying that we're being reactive. We are showing the same kind of proportional attacks against the United States that it's causing to us. So we see sort of both sides and what they're trying to do. The issue is that each side is ramping up their attacks, hoping that will convince the other side to change their course in the negotiations and come to the table. Obviously, again, when you have these direct military frictions, there are going to be a slippage. It will move past certain red lines. This is where civilians will be impacted. And at this point in time, we're talking about civilians in third countries, in the Gulf countries in and around, but not necessarily on the U.S. homeland. And so this is going to be a huge concern because there is no guarantee when you have this kind of tit for tat that it's going to push each of the adversaries back towards the negotiating table. Again, I think this is why you're going to be seeing a lot of these countries who are directly impacted, working the phones, having the various conversations because they need to ensure the security and safety of their own citizens.
The war between the U.S. and Iran shows no signs of slowing down. U.S. President Donald Trump says Iran was hit very hard after a 9th consecutive night of U.S. strikes. The Pentagon has also confirmed an American service member has been killed in Iraq during the detonation of a downed Iranian drone. Meanwhile, there are new attacks on shipping as a vessel burns off the coast of Oman after being struck by an unknown projectile. Despite the heavy exchange of fire, both Washington and Tehran say they remain open to diplomacy. I want to bring in CNN senior White House reporter Kevin Liptak, and we also have CNN producer Leila Gagarzoglu joining us now. Great to have both of you with me. Kevin, I want to start off with you. And President Trump says Iran was hit very hard. And yet, in all of this, where we've seen escalation over the last 9 days, there's talk about diplomacy perhaps still being alive. Is there a realistic path back to negotiations?
I think there is, if both sides of this come to the recognition that, this is very quickly spiraling in a way that would be very difficult to control. And so I think you do hear people, and I think it's notable who you're hearing it from, which are the diplomats on either side of this, suggesting that they view a way back to the negotiating table. You heard Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, saying that Iran was actually communicating both directly and indirectly that it wanted to negotiate. And you hear from the Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, as well, saying that the negotiations could begin, quote, when you have achieved reliable battlefield and strategic gains. I think the question is whether the political decision makers on either side of this see a pathway back to talks. And President Trump, for his part, has suggested over the last couple of weeks that he doesn't view the Iranians as credible negotiators and that he thinks there is a job to be finished militarily. And so whether he really views a pathway to diplomacy here, I think, is an open question. And you have seen escalating strikes from both sides. Last night, Central Command saying that it had carried out the 9th straight night of attacks on Iran. And you see both the U.S. and Iran increasingly going after some sensitive civilian infrastructure, including water desalination plants, power plants. On the U.S.'s part, it's been striking roads and bridges in southern Iran, which I think is leading to some anxieties that it is preparing for some sort of ground invasion there. And I think even the deaths that you have seen over the course of the last several days just indicates that even absent a ground invasion by the United States, the American troops remain very much in harm's way. The vast military installations that are arrayed across the Middle East. And I think those deaths really pose some very serious questions for President Trump about where precisely he sees all of this heading, as the cost for Americans, both in terms of gas prices and energy, but also in terms of American lives, seems to be increasing.
Yeah. All right, Kevin, thank you so much for that. Layla, I want to turn to how we've seen major escalation over the last few days, 9 days, in fact, retaliation between both sides. We've seen U.S. service members that have been killed as well, vessels under attack in the Strait of Hormuz. There is concern that the range and scope of this war is widening into a far bigger regional war. What are you hearing?
Yeah, so I think both sides are very concerned about this escalation and potential expansion. Over the last 9 days, we've basically seen the U.S. focus its strikes on that southern region of Iran, what is considered to be the defensive arch in Iran, these coastal cities and islands that allow Iran to hold control of the strait. Now, if the U.S. expands inward, and we have heard reports of explosions near Tabriz, you could see the Iranians also escalate and expand their range of targets throughout the region, meaning that this situation is quite fragile and we could see it escalate very, very quickly. Now, over the weekend, the IRGC, through a number of different Iranian channels, basically said that if the U.S. escalates, they're going to respond in kind. They're very big on proportionality and proportional responses. This is something that we've seen with the Iranians in 2020, 2024, 2025. So it's really going to come down to whether these two sides can kind of tone down and de-escalate, if they can find an off-ramp. Otherwise, we are headed to a much wider conflict.
Yeah, very quickly, in terms of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, because there's major concern that the Houthis will be activated to also, block the strait there, which is obviously a lifeline for a lot of the oil that is exported out of Saudi Arabia. Where are we with that?
Yeah, so we are hearing that the Yemeni armed forces could be closing the Bab el-Mandeb. If they do, it's obviously going to throw another wrench into the oil markets and what's going on. Obviously, the strait, according to the Iranians, remains closed. So any more pressure on the market is obviously going to impact market prices, the average person, rising cost.
All right. The U.S. and Iran is escalating across the Middle East. Kuwait says its air defenses responded to drone threats on Sunday as attacks spread across the Gulf. President Trump says Iran was hit very hard after a 9th consecutive night of U.S. strikes. All this comes after 3 U.S. service members were killed over the weekend in Iranian attacks.
Well, we feel very badly, but those great people, those great patriots were out there fighting that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Iran has been very, very badly damaged. They've lost everything almost militarily.
All right, despite the intensifying fighting, both Washington and Tehran say they may remain open to diplomacy. CNN's Stephen Collinson joins us now from Washington. Stephen, really good to see you. I mean, what a crazy 9 days it's been. I mean, the escalation ladder has been climbing and climbing. I wonder how the deaths of these U.S. service members is going to play with the American public, as we see, even though they're talking about perhaps diplomacy still being very much alive, there's major concerns that this could, become a wider war.
Elena, this was already a deeply unpopular war in the United States. And I think the fact that American service members have been dying over the weekend is going to sharpen questions about what exactly the president's endgame is here and how does he get towards it. I've already seen some messaging from various political groups this morning, which is saying that as the president shared a luxury box at the FIFA World Cup final with Gianni Infantino, Americans were dying in the Middle East. This is something I think you will probably see start to filter in Democratic arguments as we get closer to the midterm elections if this war continues. Right now, we are not anywhere near the level of casualties on the U.S. side that were caused in the Afghan and Iraq wars earlier in the century. And that did have a great political impact. And of course, there are often in these conflicts many more civilians on the other side who are killed. We should remember that. So while tragic, the troop deaths are still fairly low. But the memory of Iraq and Afghanistan is very deep in the DNA of U.S. politics. It was one reason why the president first won office in 2016 when he took the White House. So I think it would not take too much for all of that to be revived and to make the war even less popular among Americans and more of a millstone for Republican candidates in the midterm elections in November.
All right, we've got Nick Robertson as well joining us. Nick, really good to see you. The last few days in the region have been absolutely, scary for many people here across the region. Give us an idea on the diplomacy front and whether there is a potential off-ramp to end this.
It's not clear where that off-ramp is. It's not clear that either side wants to take it. They both do say, the United States and Iran do say that they're open to diplomacy. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said that today. You've had the foreign ministry spokesman in Tehran saying that again, but also saying that they're not, that Iran is not supporting the MOU, is not working to sort of further its diplomatic efforts. It is parked on one side. Today you have the Iranian Interior Minister on his way to Pakistan to meet his counterpart there, who's been really at the forefront of the mediation efforts between the United States and Iran. So does that represent, a chance here for some diplomacy to get a little bit of traction? Look, the key thing at the moment is that Iran wants to prove, and it did last night by hitting a tanker or appearing to hit a tanker close to Oman, that it controls the Strait of Hormuz. And the United States seems determined militarily to send a message that it can't, and the military path would just have to continue to erode Iran's ability to hit the shipping and damage it going through the Strait of Hormuz. That's where it's at. But diplomatically, this does feel like one of those moments where many in the Gulf states, the diplomats there, they don't say it publicly, but they're concerned about what is the end goal here of the United States. How is it going to achieve it? Can it achieve it? And if there isn't a quick resolution, therefore diplomacy has to take over. But that said, it's not, the diplomatic off-ramp is out there somewhere. Of course it is, but it doesn't seem to be within sight of where we stand today.
Yeah, and we saw how quickly the MOU basically was unraveled. Stephen, I want you to listen to what U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio had to say last night.
I think we're always open to diplomacy. It has to be real. It has to be a deal that they're willing to live by. Look, Iran a week ago was supposed to put out a statement saying that the Straits of Hormuz would be open, that they would no longer attack shipping. And instead of doing that, they attacked 3 ships. I think that was last Friday or Saturday. So, I mean, their behavior has to change in order for ours to change.
Yeah, I mean, that's super interesting because, again, the Strait of Hormuz is being mentioned. Open up the Strait. Iran has a different perspective, Stephen, about what happens in the Strait. Does President Trump sound like someone who actually wants to resume diplomatic talks? Does he act like it?
Well, 9 days of attacks on Iranian targets seem to indicate that he's not willing to go down that path right now. One interpretation of it is that he's trying to do so much damage that Iran has no choice to come back to the negotiating table. That seems unlikely, at least in the short term, and because of the history of the conflict. It seems like there are factions in Iran that almost welcome this renewal of the war, and they are never intending to give up that leverage they have on the Strait of Hormuz. What the administration has not done is explain to any of us why this round of attacks is likely to make it more likely that Iran would capitulate than the weeks of more intense attacks that it conducted with the Israelis earlier in the war. Does there come a point when they can do so much damage along the Iranian side of the strait that handicaps Iran's ability to mount these strikes? I think there's a lot of doubt about that in the US and especially in Congress right now, at a time when the administration is going to Congress to try and get more money for the war, because as we know, all it takes is a few missiles or a few drones to shut down the strait again entirely. So how we get from this point to a point where diplomacy might be a possibility without Trump stepping back, as he did in the past, and as Iran may be assuming he will do in the future, is a real question. And until then, I think the diplomatic and the economic costs will continue to pile up.
Yeah, they absolutely are. Nick, we saw strikes on Kuwait, desalination as well as the power plants, Bahrain, Jordan, first time in Syria, strikes there, as well as Iraq. Regional countries here targeted in the latest round of Iranian.
Returning now to our top story, the escalating war between the U.S. and Iran. The U.S. once again launched a wave of strikes on Iranian targets, this after President Trump warned that Iran will pay for killing 3 U.S. service members in recent days. You see 2 of them pictured there. The U.S. is sending more aircraft to the Middle East pending an escalation, along with refueling tankers necessary to allow longer-range strikes inside Iran. Joining me now is independent Congressman Kevin Kiley. Congressman, thanks so much for taking the time.
Of course, thanks for having me.
You have said in the past that Congress needs to be engaged to make any deal with Iran durable. However, in terms of military action, you voted against the War Powers Resolution. Now that this war has extended once again, and I know the administration says they have a new 60-day clock, but there are a lot of Democrats and Republicans who don't buy that. Is now the time for Congress, including Republicans and independent lawmakers like yourself, to clip the president's wings here, so to speak?
Well, it's certainly the time for Congress to be more centrally involved, and I frankly think there's been a big missed opportunity with this funding bill that's going through that doesn't really reflect a deliberate judgment on the part of Congress as to how funds should be allocated in a way that will guide this conflict towards an acceptable resolution. And I do think that Congress is owed an explanation as to why this ceasefire fell apart, what were the conditions that we thought were going to lead to its success that failed to materialize. So frankly, I think that from the very beginning of this conflict, Congress has not been nearly involved enough. You can perhaps say that the administration should have done more, but also Congress itself needs to exercise its Article 1 authority, and principally the best way to do that is through the power of the purse. And so I'm very disappointed with this funding bill that's going through, that's being done in a party line way. What we really need right now is for a bipartisan approach that will allow for all of us to set the terms for how this conflict is going to wind down.
As you know, Senator Adam Schiff, he's filed a new War Powers Resolution that would essentially reject the president's assertion that there's a new 60-day clock. Could you see Republicans and independent lawmakers like yourself supporting such a measure?
Well, the thing about the War Powers Resolution is that it doesn't really achieve what we want it to achieve, or at least what I wanted to achieve, in terms of having more meaningful congressional involvement and having a more durable basis for achieving peace here. The War Powers Resolution, first of all, what it says is that you have to immediately withdraw any and all personnel from the region, which would put our service members at risk. But at the end of the day, this is something that is never going to be signed by the president, and if he vetoes it, even if it were overridden, likely would not hold up in court. So for people who keep introducing these resolutions, I understand their instinct to want to do something to get Congress involved, but I want Congress to be involved in a way that actually matters.
I wonder what your read is of the administration's, the president's strategy in Iran, because for weeks they've been saying that the U.S. can in effect beat Iran into submission, and that ultimately, the president has said, Iran actually really wants to talk. But every day the war continues. Iran keeps striking targets. It's now killed 3 U.S. service members over the weekend. Is the president's strategy working or failing?
Well, I want to say, first of all, that of course my heart goes out to the family of our lost service members, and all of us want to ensure we do everything we can to avoid further casualties and loss of life for Americans. But I think there are serious questions about what exactly the strategy is. We've seen this sort of whiplash back and forth. We've seen this high wire act. We've seen the threats on the one hand followed by negotiations and temporary agreements on the other. And this is why I've said from the very beginning that if we want to actually have something durable here, we need to have Congress and all interested parties involved. So that means involving the Gulf states, involving our allies, and coming to what understanding we can that will achieve the goals that are indispensable here, which is opening the Strait of Hormuz, winding this conflict down, and assuring that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon.
The president is now considering, apparently, operations up to and including ground operations to take Karg Island, which would, of course, put more U.S. forces in danger. Given how unpopular this war is already, do you think U.S. forces should fight on the ground, to fight and potentially die in an expansion of this war?
I certainly don't want to see that. I don't want to see the war expand. I want to see the conflict come to an end. But I want to make sure that it's done in a way that protects U.S. interests and assures we don't leave Iran in a position where they can inflict even greater harm on Americans, on our allies, on the region, and on the world going forward.
Congressman Kevin Kiley, we appreciate you coming back on the show.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
And good evening, I'm Erin Burnett. And out front tonight, the breaking news. 100 U.S. troops injured in just the last 2 weeks of the Iran war. 100 in the past 2 weeks. This news coming from the Pentagon tonight, and it's in addition to at least 3 American service members who have been killed in just recent days. Well, tonight, Trump is threatening revenge, posting, quote, every time Iran kills an American soldier, they will pay for that killing many times over. This directive has been passed on to the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Daniel Kaine, and every leader in the military. Trump's threat comes as the U.S. right now is sending additional fighter jets to the Middle East, including F-16s and F-35s. Now, the war began 143 days ago, which is part of the reason it's so stunning that 100 American troops have been injured in the past 2 weeks, a toll that continues. The administration is quick. They love to put out these videos when strikes are happening, right? This is a CENTCOM video. They put them out really quickly. That is not the case when it comes to releasing the details about the toll this war is taking on American service members. Until the announcement just moments ago by the Pentagon that the 100 service members were injured in the past 2 weeks, the military has been painfully slow, sometimes waiting up to weeks to acknowledge military injuries. In fact, why are they even putting those numbers out now? Maybe in part because of all the reporting in the New York Times over the weekend about this issue. The Pentagon source tells CNN, well, they're waiting on all this for security reasons. Well, okay, but the reality is the administration has not been transparent about the toll of this war, full stop. Not about the THAADs that have been blown out, the radars blown out, the planes, the human beings and the human injuries. The Pentagon has not held a press briefing in 2.5 months. No questions taken and no answers given about the war or what strategy there may be moving forward, like this whole conversation about Karg Island, which is Groundhog's Day, back in the front burner again. Iran warning of repercussions if the U.S. seizes the island, something that Trump has suggested again is on the table.
Maybe we'll take over Karg Island. We may take over Karg Island. There's not a thing they can do about it.
But in that silence about strategy, about the damage done, about the lives forever impacted and lost in this war, we are learning more about one of the American service members killed in Jordan. Tyler James Feehan was 25 years old. His parents shared these images of their son without front. He was their only child. They say he was loved and adored by everyone who crossed paths with him, and he was set to be married when he returned from this deployment. Our thoughts are with that family and his parents and their indescribable loss. Kristen Holmes is out front live outside the White House. And Kristen, Trump now threatening revenge against Iran in that tweet, saying for every American troop killed, many more Iranians will feel U.S. revenge. What does that mean? Is that just bluster, or is there a plan and a strategy here as you understand it?
Well, it certainly doesn't seem like bluster tonight, with Central Command announcing that they were doing their 10th consecutive night of strikes. One thing to keep in mind here is that President Trump is angry, and he is attending that dignified transfer tomorrow of those fallen soldiers. And at the same time, mediators had proposed today, floated an idea of a 10-day ceasefire. Now, we had heard from the White House and from U.S. officials who did acknowledge that this existed. They did not give any details of how far along this proposal was, but they also said this, and this was what they said about President Trump, really playing down the idea that he was going to accept this, saying right now President Trump is focused on making Iran pay for their violations of the MOU and their continued acts of terrorism in the Strait of Hormuz. Then they went on to say, in addition, the president will make Iran pay for the recent deaths of U.S. soldiers. Now, this proposal was floated before Central Command announced that it was launching its 10th night of consecutive strikes. So it goes to show you where the president's head is at. Now, whether or not that means an escalation beyond these strikes, that is what we are trying to find out. But the president is angry. We know that they have been looking for a diplomatic off-ramp. He is still trying, and U.S. officials are trying to get Iran back to the negotiating table. But it does appear that we are in a real punishment phase for Iran because of those troop deaths now.
All right, Kristen, thank you very much, reporting from the White House tonight. And I want to go out front now to Democratic Congressman Adam Smith, the top Democrat on the Armed Services Committee. And I appreciate your time tonight. So obviously, you've been a vocal critic of so many things about Trump's war in Iran. The U.S. now increasing aircraft numbers in the Middle East, and significantly so, it seems. Trump's warning Iran will pay for killing U.S. soldiers, again, in his words, quote, many times over. Do you know what all this actually is going to add up to?
I don't think anybody does, least of all Donald Trump. I mean, look, I don't want to belabor the point, but this is why it was so stupid to start this war in the first place. Trump honestly thought that he would drop bombs for 3 or 4 weeks and the Iranian regime would collapse. And that was just completely idiotic. No one who would pay any attention to what's going on thought that was going to happen. So when that didn't happen, he just keeps doubling down on a bad strategy. Look, we need to end this war and get the best negotiated peace we can get. And that's not going to be great at this point because we've given Iran so much leverage by starting the war, showing them they can control the Strait of Hormuz. Now, as far as what Trump's going to do, I don't know. He's talking about Carg Island, talking about revenge. I mean, there's no strategy, there's no plan, there's no vision in there. Look, I said this last week. I think the president has reached the point where he's just not fit for office. He doesn't know what he's doing, and he's dragging us into an endless conflict. So I hope the Republicans will speak up and push him in a different direction, because right now he's just headed over a cliff.
Congressman, the cost of this war has been profound, and in so many ways. We understand in just the first few days of the war, all of the THAAD missile defenses in the region were taken out except for maybe one. And there's a lot more where that came from. So there's that. And then there is the human cost, which I find just so stunning for the American public at this point in this war to understand that 100 American troops have been wounded in just the past 2 weeks. This is in just the past 2 weeks. And we're perhaps only finding out about it because reporters have been pushing and trying to get to the truth. So what do you know the full extent of American injuries? And do you know the full extent of equipment losses. When I mention fact,
we don't.
Yeah.
Look, we don't because the Pentagon has not been transparent about that. You know, I get reports from people who they know a service member at a base in Jordan or Iraq or somewhere say, yeah, we heard there was an attack, there's 20 or 30 people wounded. Pentagon doesn't say anything about it. We dig into it as the New York Times has, and you then find out. But look, this is, again, no transparency. As you said, no press conference, no conversation about this. We have a dictator running this country. We have never had a situation where we've been at war and the president has treated it as his own war where he doesn't have to share information with the American people or with the Congress. I mean, this is a frightening situation, and yeah, they have not been telling us what's been happening in terms of lost equipment, in terms of the cost of the war, and certainly in terms of the service members who have been wounded.
Can I just say something that I think is, I guess it's painfully obvious, but I feel like I have to say it, Congressman? You are the top Democrat on the Armed Services Committee. It would seem to me definitional that if anybody knew the extent of losses of things like the entire missile defense system for the United States bases and countries that we support in the region and American troops being injured, that your source wouldn't be somebody calling who has a friend who serves on a base, but you're telling me it is.
Yeah, well, and we're digging. My staff is constantly in contact with as many people as we can at the Pentagon. You know, they are just not being transparent. We have to sort of pull it out of them or find it in one place or another. So, look, I mean, the lack of transparency certainly is concerning, but the bigger concern, we're in a war that we have no idea how to get out of. And the costs are mounting. The service members' deaths are unbelievably tragic. They continue to be at risk. The financial costs, but also just the international economic costs. Now we've got the Houthis saying they're going to shut down the Bab al-Mandab Strait, which is only going to add to these problems. We need to negotiate a settlement and end this conflict.
Congressman, I want to tell everyone a little bit more about the U.S. soldier I just mentioned a moment ago. He was killed last week in Jordan. First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan. He was 25 years old, and as I told you, he's his parents' only son. He was going to be coming home after this deployment to get married. They say he was supposed to come, his parents do, that he was supposed to come back on the day he was killed. And he was 2 weeks away from finishing his second master's degree. He was getting ready to attend law school, and his parents shared with us something that he wrote about that desire to go to law school, where he wrote, "I have learned that the law is not just an academic exercise. It is a critical tool for operational success and the protection of soldiers. Just as I have strived to equip my formation with the resources to succeed, I want to become the advocate they can rely on to clear any legal obstacles in their path." Obviously an incredible young person. Do you believe his death was preventable?
100%. I mean, the war shouldn't have been started in the first place. And once it was started, Trump not taking ceasefire offers, I mean, look, we knew that our bases were vulnerable to Iranian missiles and drones. We started this war with no clear plan to defend them.
Tonight, the Pentagon admitting nearly 100 troops have been hurt in just the last 2 weeks of war with Iran. That is on top of the 3, possibly 4 servicemen and women killed over the weekend. And new strikes and counterstrikes underway tonight. John King here in for Anderson. It is the 10th round of airstrikes against Iran since the ceasefire broke down. It comes with mediators today floating a 10-day pause in hostilities. But President Trump had already signaled his intentions at lunchtime, saying every time Iran kills an American soldier, they will pay for that killing many times over. And at 4 p.m. today, CENTCOM launching new attacks. A U.S. official telling CNN, even though ceasefire talks are continuing, the president is focused right now on making Iran pay for violating that memorandum of understanding, and this official says, for the American troops killed in action. This is video of a deadly missile strike on a Jordanian airbase overnight Friday into Saturday. This morning, the Pentagon identified 2 soldiers killed in that attack. Private Isabella Gonzalez of Texas was just 19 years old. She was assigned to an air defense regiment based in Germany. First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan was from Hawaii and served also in missile defense with a unit from Fort Bragg, North Carolina. A third, as yet unidentified serviceman, was killed in northern Iraq, and a fourth is missing still in Jordan. And again, as we mentioned, the Pentagon spokesman says nearly 100 service members have been hurt since July 7th, mostly mild concussions, he said. Separately,
A CNN data review shows that the Pentagon has been slow to disclose war injuries, which that same spokesman says is to protect other service members who might be jeopardized, he claims, by releasing such information prematurely. But it is the new fatalities that the president, first and foremost, is concerned with, the most since March, when 13 U.S. service members lost their lives.
We feel very badly, but you know, those great people, those great patriots were out there fighting that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Iran has been very, very badly damaged. They've lost everything almost militarily. They've got very little left.
Recent events, though, call into question that very little left part. Iran stepping up attacks on Kuwait and Jordan, with both reporting missile intercepts, more missile intercepts today. And the U.S. official tells us the Pentagon is sending more fighter jets and support aircraft to the region. Not what you'd be doing if Iran truly, as the president said, has very little left. Complicating the picture, the Iran-backed Houthi rebel group in Yemen today declaring a blockade on Saudi shipping, which has to go through the Bab al-Mandeb. That's the other maritime choke point in the region.
As the U.S. bombs Iran for a 10th straight night, sources say mediators floated another 10-day ceasefire. But, quote, right now, President Trump is focused on making Iran pay for violating the last agreement. Today, the president posted, every time Iran kills an American soldier, they will pay for that killing many times over. 3 American service members were killed over the weekend. Their deaths mark the first American fatalities from Iranian fire since March. And after being accused of slow walking the information, tonight the Pentagon says that nearly 100 U.S. troops have been injured in just the past 2 weeks. Over the weekend, 25-year-old First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan and 19-year-old Private Isabella Gonzalez were killed in an Iranian missile attack on an airbase in Jordan. And the Pentagon says another U.S. service member was killed during a, quote, controlled detonation of an Iranian drone in northern Iraq.
We feel very badly, but you know, those great people, those great patriots were out there fighting that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Iran has been very, very badly damaged. They've lost everything almost militarily. They've got very little left.
Iran apparently has enough left to target U.S. bases in neighboring countries. Enough left that more U.S. fighter jets are being deployed to the region. The president's own comments illustrating the competing claims that even some of his biggest supporters now struggle to make sense of. 17 American lives have been lost, and the Pentagon's disclosure that nearly 100 more Americans have been hurt in recent weeks, coming after criticism that it did not publicly disclose many of those injuries as they occurred. And that comment from the president that we just played is hardly a one-off. Trump has repeatedly insisted that Iran poses virtually no threat at all.
Tonight, Iran's Navy is gone. Their Air Force is in ruins. Their leaders, most of them, terrorist regime they led, are now dead.
We have many ways we can win, but we've already won militarily. They have very little left. We wiped out their Navy, their Air Force, their radar, their leaders. We wiped out everybody. We're blowing everything away, and we're going to end that war very quickly. They have no Navy left. They have no Air Force left. They have no anti-aircraft equipment left, no radar left, no leaders left.
Lieutenant Feehan and Private Gonzalez died in a missile attack barely a month after the president defended allowing Iran to keep its missile program.
They have to have some because other people have some. You got to have some. Somebody said, you shouldn't give them one. You shouldn't let them have any missile. I said, well, what am I going to do? Am I going to let Saudi Arabia have missiles, but they can't have them? Yes, sir. It doesn't work that way, you know. It doesn't work that way. And missiles aren't the problem. Missiles are, they hurt a little location, but they don't blow up the planet.
Iran, in the meantime, is expanding its targets in the region. U.S. positions in 7 Middle East countries have been attacked since Thursday night, which, again, seems to run counter to the president repeatedly saying this.
They want to make a deal so badly. They want to make a deal so badly. But we'll see what happens.
They want to make a deal so badly. We'll see what happens.
They want to make a deal so badly. They want to make a deal so badly.
Those contradictions are perhaps why even some of the president's most vocal supporters are starting to say things like this.
Tonight,
The war with Iran is starting to look like the very quagmire President Trump promised he would never get into. There's no clear exit strategy. There's no easy way to withdraw. And what we're being told and hearing day after day seems to clarify nothing. Just a new attempt to reword, I don't know. It's like a scene out of Groundhog Day if the stakes weren't so high. Nearly 5 months of on and off again attacks, a ceasefire in April, an agreement in June, one promised breakthrough after another, only for each one to unravel. But this time, the fighting isn't just flaring back up, it is dramatically escalating. The Pentagon is saying tonight, nearly 100 U.S. service members have been injured in just the last 2 weeks, and we haven't been told the full extent of those injuries. We do know that, tragically, 3 American service members have been killed since Friday. 2 died in Iranian attacks at a military base in Jordan. First Lieutenant Tyler James Feehan was 25. He originally enlisted in Hawaii and was based out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Private Isabella Gonzalez was just 19. She was from Texas, assigned to an air and missile defense battalion in Germany. The 3rd American died in northern Iraq during the controlled detonation of an Iranian drone. That service member's name has not yet been released. The U.S. military death toll in this war, now 17. And President Trump says Iran will pay many times over for each American soldier they kill.
We feel very badly, but you know, those great people, those great patriots are out there fighting that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Iran has been very, very badly damaged. They've lost everything almost militarily. They've got very little left.
Iran is showing it still has enough firepower to kill and injure American troops, and enough leverage over the Strait of Hormuz to hit the American economy. Those are the warning signs, blaring, of a quagmire. The human toll mounts, the price tag, U.S. tax dollars, mind you, climbing. The public gets fed up, and the end stays out of reach. Just look at the money. One estimate puts the cost at $40 billion. And that was a month ago, before the new round of fighting. Then there's the public, which saw this war as unpopular from the start. Well, now the verdict is overwhelming. Do you know a Washington Post Ipsos poll shows 68% of Americans say the war with Iran is not worth fighting? Now, let's just put that number in historical context, shall we? It is higher than the worst readings for the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. And it took Afghanistan nearly 12 years to reach that level of public opposition. Iraq, more than 4 years. Iran, 4.5 months. And then there's the most basic sign of a quagmire, no clear end. Tonight is the 10th straight night of American strikes on Iran. Iranian attacks are hitting America's Gulf allies. And the administration is sending more fighter jets to the region, which brings us back to the president and the exact kind of open-ended conflict he spent years promising he would avoid.
War and aggression will not be my first instinct.
We are ending the era of endless wars.
I'm not going to start a war. I'm going to stop wars.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars that we end, and perhaps most importantly, the wars we never get into. A short time ago, the United States military began major combat operations in Iran. I think you'll see it's going to be a short-term excursion.
What makes you so sure this won't become a quagmire?
We're not going to be there.
You're convinced this won't become a quagmire?
It's not a quagmire. Just wiped out the military of a very dangerous country. We're almost finished.
He said we're almost finished 6 weeks ago. And since then, the ceasefire has collapsed, and 3 more Americans have lost their lives. That's not almost finished. That's a conflict getting worse, with no clear way out. Textbook definition of a quagmire.
World lead, the intensifying war with Iran. CENTCOM announcing just moments ago that a new round of U.S. strikes on Iran is underway. We've also learned the U.S. is sending additional fighter jets to the Middle East as President Trump vows revenge following the death of 3 U.S. service members over the weekend. He posted on Truth Social this afternoon, quote, "Every time Iran kills an American soldier, they will pay for that killing many times over." Now we are learning more about the fallen, the first U.S. casualties since March. 19-year-old Private Isabella Gonzalez and 25-year-old First Lieutenant Tyler James Fian were killed in an Iranian missile attack on an airbase in Jordan. Another death was just announced yesterday. The Pentagon says a U.S. service member was killed during a, quote, controlled detonation of an Iranian drone in northern Iraq. The White House says the president plans to attend the killed U.S. service member's dignified transfer ceremony when the remains are brought back to the United States. Meanwhile, the war also seems to be intensifying at sea. Last night, 2 ships were attacked in the Persian Gulf, close to the already choked Strait of Hormuz. That is according to British Shipping Monitor. Back here in the U.S., the uncertainty and disrupted shipping channels are spiking gas prices once again, now averaging $4 a gallon. Still, some diplomacy continues. Sources tell CNN mediators between the U.S. and Iran have floated the idea of a 10-day ceasefire to maybe get to more significant negotiations. The sources add this short ceasefire could include lifting restrictions on the Strait of Hormuz. There's a lot going on. Joining us now to talk about all of it, Republican Congressman from Florida, Carlos Jimenez. He's on the Armed Services Committee. Sir, really appreciate your time. Just to start with, do you believe right now that the kind of path that this conflict is on is one that will work out the way the president wants it to?
I think that the path that that we're on there's only one end to this path, is that which was the original intent, was to make sure that Iran never has a nuclear weapon. And if we get anything less than that, then it has not been a successful endeavor. And so I would anticipate that at the end, whenever that end happens, that Iran will not be able to obtain a nuclear weapon, because that's what we're fighting for right now, because we know that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, they will continue to terrorize their neighbors and continue to sponsor terrorism around the world and actually have a bigger stranglehold on the Straits of Hormuz. And so that's something that just can't happen.
What is your threshold for ensuring Iran cannot obtain a nuclear weapon? Does the nuclear material have to be removed from the country? I think there's some ambiguity right now about what that would actually mean in practice. What is yours?
Mine is that, yes, you remove the nuclear material, and that there is a rigorous inspection routine, that an enforceable inspection, that we can go wherever we want, whenever we want, how we want to, wherever it is in Iran that we think that they're doing something bad, which we know that they're going to try to do something, all the time, because that's who they are. But as long as we have those rights, that's a possibility. And so those are the things that the least that I want to see is an enforceable, very rigorous inspection routine to make sure that Iran is not doing what it's not supposed to be doing.
Do you think the agreement on the Memorandum of Understanding, which now seems to kind of be a little bit in tatters given this back and forth, was that a mistake to sign off on that?
Absolutely. I think any agreement that right now gives you a ceasefire is a mistake. We can sit down, we can negotiate all you want, but we're still going to have a blockade. We're still going to be, trying to dismantle your military capability, your ability to create these weapons, and degrade you as much as possible while we're talking. Anything now, anything that says, oh, we want a 10-day ceasefire, I think I've been there before. I've read that book. I've seen that movie. And you know what? You just can't trust the Iranians. All they want to do is stall, stall, stall. This has to stop. There is no more stalling. You come to the table, you're serious, but while you're still talking to us, we're going to do what we're going to do. And we're going to put a chokehold on you economically through the blockade, and we're going to continue to pound you militarily. And by the way, we may take some of your assets, maybe Carge Island, maybe something else that's of value to them, so that at the end, when they come to the table, they're actually serious, because we have something that they covet. And that's what we need to do. And so, yeah, I'm a little bit more aggressive with the Iranians, but look, I've seen this for 47 years. We know who they are. We know what they do. I'm frankly surprised that the president actually gave them a 60-day, ceasefire. How many times are they going to do this until we stop saying, okay, enough? We've got to do what we got to do and then come to the table. If you want to come to the table, fine, but we're going to continue to do what we're going to do.
Are you surprised by the capabilities, particularly on the targeting side of things, that the Iranians have been able to demonstrate over the course of these last several days of attacks that have led to the deaths of U.S. Service members?
Am I surprised by it? No, I think they have they're gaining capabilities. They have allies in Russia and certainly China that I'm sure is helping them with some of these targeting capabilities. We have to destroy the way the mechanism that they have for producing these weapons, and we have to do really impose some sanctions on those that are giving them technology that may be helping them to target our military personnel. And so, I would expect that our intelligence sources will tell us exactly how they're getting this technology, how they got this technology, and then those that gave them the technology should suffer the consequences of U.S. sanctions. And so, this is an all of the above kind of approach to this problem. We should be helping any of the insurgents inside of Iran that want to see regime change, and then at the same time, military pressure, economic pressure, and then maybe what will bring them to the table is finally, if we take some of their territory and say, well, that's no longer Iran, maybe that'll bring them to the table. But you just continue to ramp up the pressure until they come to the table, and continue that pressure until we get an agreement.
The New York Times reports Iran carried out 3 other strikes against U.S. forces in Jordan in recent days, injuring dozens of service members, damaging several helicopters. But the, quote, Pentagon did not disclose the earlier strikes nor the casualties and damage they inflicted. The Pentagon spokesperson insists the department is not hiding the numbers, but the Pentagon hasn't held a briefing in 2.5 months. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has not explained the military strategy behind the current renewed strikes. Do you feel like the American people have enough information at this point?
Look, I think that the American people do have enough information.